Good afternoon. I hope this week is going well for you. And let me just, as usual, begin with just a few reminders on where we are. Obviously, this lecture is for the Monday group that does not come in on Wednesday, as well as anyone who, for any reason, is not able to come to class at the moment. I remind you that you will also have a lecture that will become available on Friday, and there will be an activity associated with that, either Flipgrid or something written. And I also wanted to mention that you should know that the first quiz will take place on Monday. I believe that as the Monday group, I will probably be giving you this in class on Monday. And as I am currently planning it, it should be a 20-question fill-in-the-blank multiple-choice type quiz on factual questions. And the questions will relate to the first two things that we have covered in this class, i.e. the discussion about the idea of culture last week, Raymond Williams, Cassirer, and the Hermeneutic Circle, and then Stone Age culture this week, including everything that we do through Friday's lecture. Usually the quizzes will only cover the unit immediately preceding, but exceptionally I'm going to include the short section that we did on the idea of culture. And for that section, the kinds of questions I will ask will simply just be questions about sort of who said what, which set of ideas are associated with Cassirer, Williams, and so on. And my quizzes tend to be focused on things that I actually cover in lectures. Readings are included as well, but I tend to emphasize on quizzes things that I actually cover in lectures. But that definitely includes the recorded online lectures as well. And I also tend to focus on what I consider to be more important, larger facts rather than little nitty-gritty details. So just be aware that that's coming. I'll say more about that on Friday's lecture. Today what I'd like to do is to continue our discussion of Stone Age society, which we are examining through the lens of a cultural work. In this class, we always have a particular society we're examining and a cultural work associated with it. And the cultural work we're looking at this time are the Lascaux cave paintings found in southwestern France. On Monday's class, I introduced you to how the caves were found and gave you an initial tour of the caves. For today, you read an essay on what prehistoric art is, and you also did a virtual tour of the caves on your own. And I'd like to just sort of begin with a little bit of introduction and then to start talking specifically about what we know about the people who produced the Lascaux cave paintings. But let's always have on our minds the question of how we will know what we know in this class. In other words, what are the methods and approaches used for understanding culture and particularly cultural artifacts from the past? There's a series of different types of knowledge-related questions we can ask about Lascaux. What is factual information that we can know about the cave paintings? The physical setup of the caves, the type of technologies that were used to paint it, the sort of how much light there is and things like that in the cave. But in addition to sort of factual information, there is the genuinely hermeneutic question of what do the cave paintings mean? And again, hermeneutic is just a way of describing the fact that we are engaged in interpretation. And again, my most basic definition of interpretation is that we are looking at something that can be thought of as code, and we're thinking about how to decode it. Cultural works are fundamentally works of human code that we then have to decode. So, and the question I would suggest that asking what does the painting mean is a way of asking how do we decode it. And a bigger question that is connected to this is what in general does art mean for the Lascaux people and other Stone Age societies? How are we to decode, if you will, not just individual paintings, but the broader function of painting in this society? So again, I will be telling you things today about who the people are who painted these works, but we should always keep in mind these interpretive questions of how we know what we know as well. So, excuse me. I would like to just sort of briefly harp upon the hermeneutic circle, which, as you can see, I like talking about because that really captures the essence of the method, the approach that we are using in this class. So, in a sense, I think that you could say that when we approach Lascaux, we are engaged in the hermeneutic circle. And to illustrate this, I would like you just to think for a moment about the viewing that I had you do for today, the virtual tour of the cave. Think about for a moment what were some details in that tour that you took that stood out to you. And then think for a moment, too, about how you interpreted those details. What were questions that you asked of them, but also what were sort of temporary, provisional explanations or interpretations you gave of those individual features of the cave. So as you consider that, I would suggest that you are probably at some basic level, and maybe even a fairly sophisticated level, engaged in what we've been calling the hermeneutic circle, which again is a kind of a key to reflecting on what it means to have knowledge in sort of cultural fields of study, like history, for example. What I think you probably do is you start by trying to interpret the specific detail, a specific instance of painting in the cave or a particular property of the cave. And you probably interpret that based on some kind of understanding of what the cave as such means. If you think about the cave primarily as a kind of Stone Age museum, you might think about the ways in which the artworks that the individual artwork that you focused on is displayed or preserved or something like that. So, in other words, your sort of initial interpretation of a particular part of the cave is based on a kind of assumption about what the whole is. But let's say that someone points out that there's a different way of sort of thinking about the part. For example, that it might be something that that the animals that you see might not just be pictures of animals, but might be animals that are somehow tied to a set of, say, religious or magical beliefs. Once you have interpreted the part that way, that's going to sort of flow back into the way that you interpret the whole. You'll no longer sort of see the cave structure as a kind of primitive museum, but perhaps as a kind of Stone Age church or shrine. And I'm using these just as examples. I'm not saying that yet that that's what that is. So again, you're always kind of involved in this sort of back and forth activity, this back and forth mental activity in which you're making a kind of assumption about the whole to interpret the part, but that once you have then sort of thought about the part and reached a kind of deeper understanding of the part, that might flow back into the way that you interpret the whole. And again, I would just sort of encourage you to sort of be mindful, be conscious, to think about the way that your own mind sort of goes back and forth between in trying to understand these cultural activities that we are looking at. I would also suggest, remember, that the hermeneutic circle, in addition to being about the part and the whole, is also about the familiar and the strange. You might seize upon a detail in the cave that is similar to something that you have experience with. For example, you might say that some of it looks like bathroom graffiti. And so you're taking something that is strange or different and understanding it in terms of the familiar. And maybe that sort of initial activity allows you to understand the strange thing in such a way that you reach a new insight about it that sort of changes what you consider to be familiar. We're always engaged in this sort of back and forth process. So once again, the Lascaux, a detail of the Lascaux painting might give us a detail about the people who made them, and knowing more about the people who made them may impact how we see the paintings. And the reason why I mentioned this point, which is kind of yet another version of the hermeneutic circle, is that's a little bit what we're going to be doing today. We're going to think about what are some characteristics of the people who produced these caves that you can identify simply just based on looking at the Lascaux artwork and the cave that it's part of, and then see if you can figure out some things about the people who produced them. And then, in turn, once I have told you a little bit more about the people who produced them, that might improve or alter your understanding of the artwork itself. Okay, so enough. That's kind of what I call my sort of sermon on the hermeneutic circle. I'll bring that to a conclusion, and let's actually start talking then about the people of Lascaux. Think for a moment, though, what is information that you have about them, facts that you might know about them just from the cave paintings? Pause and consider that just a moment. So there might be any number of facts that you could derive from them. You could call attention to the somewhat obvious fact that that wild animals are quite important to them based on the fact that they paint them. You might ponder the fact that they probably had certain forms of technology that allowed them to turn sort of various pigments or plant fibers and so on into paint, because these walls are indeed painted. You might go a little bit deeper and sort of reflect upon the fact that they must have had means to illuminate the caves, because as I've said on several occasions, the caves emit no natural light, no light from the outside world, and perhaps that they would have had enough technology to haul themselves in some ways up to the ceiling so that they could paint not only on the ceiling, but remember, in a situation where there's no natural light. So all of those might be clues that could tell you a little bit about these people. So, but let me sort of take it from the top. The first thing to know, and again, I'm sorry to sort of come back to my obsession with the word hermeneutic, but I would just say that we do need to say that when we confront the people of Lascaux, we confront some hermeneutic, i.e. interpretive challenges. In other words, we encounter obstacles that place serious limits on our ability to know these people. Why? First of all, there are no written records. This is the only society that we're going to deal with this semester that does not have writing. But they did not have writing. Indeed, that's actually one of the meanings of the words prehistoric. Prehistoric does not so much mean before history. It literally means, or it more accurately means, before written history. So by definition, if you will, these people do not have written records that we can read. or even that we can't read. The only evidence that we have of these peoples is archaeological evidence, which means material traces of their lives that they almost, in most cases, accidentally or unwittingly left behind them, but that gives us clues open to interpretation about how they lived. So we have skeletons. We know something about who they were physiologically, if you will. And those skeletons can be dated by this method called radiocarbon dating, because skeletons were once alive, and that's what radiocarbon dating is effectively can measure. We also can know about them through what's called kitchen midden, which is really a fancy archaeological term for trash. Every time these peoples would sort of sit at a campsite and have a meal, there are material traces of that are left. And sometimes those traces can be found, can be analyzed, and that can give us interesting information, such as, in particular, about what their diet was, what they ate. We get into even more interesting territory when we find artifacts from these people. And this is, I would say, sort of perhaps the most authentically cultural realm, i.e. the realm of human-made objects. And this includes artwork, but it also includes things like tools, which I will be discussing. And finally, I would just remind you to consider a fact that is kind of almost sort of sobering in a way, that we simply do not know anything about what these people even called themselves or how they referred to their own lives. The term Lascaux is a more or less modern, at least by Stone Age standards, name for the location. We have no words at all for that were used by the people that we are talking about. And that's rarely the case in history, because usually we're talking about literate peoples who thus tell us what terms they used and what terms they used for themselves. In this case, we have no such words. Every word that we use to refer to these people comes from our language, not theirs. But despite these hermeneutic challenges, we actually do have real knowledge about these people. Limited, but still real and useful. Let me start by saying a few things about who they are as creatures, if you will. And to do so, I need to explain the term Upper Paleolithic transition. This is a term from archaeology, but I'd like to try and make it simple. The Lascaux caves are considered to be between 18,000 and 17,000 years old. If you wanted to put that in BC terms, i.e. before the Common Era and after the Common Era, that would mean that they are basically between 16 and 15,000 years BCE. But if you do it in terms of years ago, it's 18 to 17,000. The humans who lived at this time, and thus who made the Lascaux caves, came out of what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic transition. Let me comment briefly on the word Paleolithic. I will return to that later. Paleolithic is a scientific term coming from ancient Greek that means old stone. Paleo means old. Lithic is a word for stone. So it's the Old Stone Age, which is the earliest part of the Stone Age. We'll see there's something called the New Stone Age. So I will say more about that shortly, but just for now, make note of the fact that we're talking about the Old Stone Age. And the Upper Paleolithic transition really refers to the arrival, the advent, or the development would be, I guess, be the best term, of anatomically modern human beings, which is a way of saying human beings like us. The anatomically modern human being came into existence around 35,000 years ago. In other words, roughly 17,000 years before Lascaux. As old as Lascaux might seem to us, you could sort of say that Lascaux is actually not so much early as kind of midpoint in the history of our species. And the name of our species, I'm sure you've heard this before, is we are sometimes referred to as Cro-Magnon man, which refers to an archaeological site called Cro-Magnon in France, where the earliest forms of our ancestors, if you will, were discovered. But the more strictly biological and physiological term is Homo sapiens sapiens. Homo is the Latin word for man in the sense of human being. Sapiens means knowledge or having knowledge. The reason why the term is doubled, why you have Homo sapiens sapiens, is not to suggest that we're really knowledgeable or really smart. It's to distinguish us from another offshoot of the Homo sapiens genus that are called Neanderthals. So there actually is Homo sapiens sapiens and Homo sapiens neanderthalis. I won't tell you more about the Neanderthals right now, although they're very interesting. I simply just want to point out that these paintings were not done by Neanderthals. They were done by Homo sapiens sapiens. And again, what that fundamentally means, what all this is a long roundabout way of saying, is they are produced by the same physiological creature that we are. These paintings were not produced by a sort of primate that came at an earlier stage of human development than the stage that we are a part of. They are exactly our stage. The authors, the painters of Lascaux are, in some sense, at least in a physiological sense, us. Now, the other thing that we can say about the cave painters of Lascaux is that they belong to the Magdalenian culture. What do I mean by culture in this sense? Our favorite word returns. In this context, culture refers to a particular stage of development that archaeologists have been able to identify that lasted over a period of time. So the Magdalenian culture, in other words, refers to a culture of Homo sapiens sapiens living in the Paleolithic period who probably lived from roughly 17,000 to 12,000 before the Common Era, i.e. 19,000 to 14,000 years ago. In other words, exactly when the Lascaux cave paintings were made. And they tended to exist or they didn't tend to exist, they existed in Western Europe, in a territory that's quite broad, that extends from roughly modern-day Poland in the east to the Atlantic coast of France and parts of Spain in the west. And that also extends from sort of what is today the English Channel to the Mediterranean. And again, and the term Magdalenian, once again, is simply a term that is attributed based on, by reference to an archaeological site in which Magdalenian artifacts were found. And the term Magdalenian culture simply refers to the fact that that multiple sites have been found across this space that share certain basic characteristics. For example, to state the most obvious one, the characteristics of tools made within this time frame are the same. Okay, so Magdalenian culture is merely just a way of kind of referring to a stage in human development that archaeologists have been able to identify based on evidence that they have found. So what can we say then about the Magdalenian peoples? One of the most important ways of talking about these people, based on concrete knowledge that we have, is of course in reference to their technology. And I use the term technology very seriously here. These people had technology in the sense that they constructed tools that they used as part of daily life. That's all that I mean at a basic level by technology. Specifically, they have what archaeologists describe as an extensive flint tool industry, meaning they really do have a continuous and ongoing process of producing flint tools. Let me say a word or two about how these flint tools are made. Look at the picture that you should be able to see right now. These are relatively small tools. You'll notice that they are quite sharp. One of the features of flint is that it is a rock that fractures easily, and that because it fractures easily, produces very sharp edges that are useful as tools, either as something that you could put on the tip of a spear to kill a herd animal, or that you could use to scrape the skin of an animal that you've killed in order to use its skins as clothing. It's a useful rock for producing tools. But think about how you would make those. Look at that tool and imagine how you might produce it. How do you expect that tool to have been made? I will just come back to this in a moment, but I'd like to sort of illustrate this fact by showing you a video, if I can get it properly into my screen here, that is an archaeologist who has studied these techniques, which shows an archaeologist who has studied these techniques recreating the process. And again, by the way, I would say that's an extremely interesting thing, that we can sort of interpret or understand the society by literally kind of reverse engineering these tools. Take a look at this video, and what I would like you to think about as you watch this video is not just what the technique is, but what does this technique tell us about what I would call sort of the mental ability or thought process of the people who produce these tools. There's one of your tools. So, again, think about the thought process behind this. And I don't know necessarily what you would think about it. We talked a little bit about it in class today. Here's what I would suggest. I imagine that some of you, totally reasonably and understandably, would assume that the process of producing these tools basically involved something kind of like, for want of a better term, carving them, i.e. taking some sort of instrument, banging away at a piece of rock until it acquires the shape that you're seeking. But that's not, in fact, what happens. What they do is prepare a rock which is called the sort of carinated core. And once they have that rock in the sort of in an ideal shape, they then use another rock or bone or blunt instrument to strike the carinated core in such a way that it fractures in ways that they can anticipate. And it is the fractures, or specifically what are called the flakes, that become the tools. And what I think is very interesting about this, first of all, it shows forethought. Okay, it's not just looking at a rock or seeing a blunt, a sharp edge in a rock and saying, that can serve as something to cut with. It is looking at something that is not yet a hard edge, not yet a sharp edge, and anticipating that it can become one if it is manipulated in a particular way. So there's several things I think that are interesting about this. First of all, it shows forethought. You are looking at something that does not yet look like a flint tool and anticipating that it can become one if it is dealt with in a particular way. I would also say at a basic level, it shows a kind of understanding of the properties of rock. That this kind of rock has the feature of fracturing in a way that is useful to tool production. And then finally, I would say that it, in a way, sort of exhibits what I would call abstract thinking. And I mean abstract thinking in a very simple sense here. I simply mean that by abstract thinking, I mean the ability, and maybe imagination is very close to what I mean here. It means the ability to sort of see or place before your mind something that your senses are not perceiving. So clearly the person who made these tools knew that those tools were possible, conceived the possible existence of those tools, even though their senses did not show them anything that looked remotely like the tools. Rather, they saw a rock that they knew had certain properties, and based on their experience, they knew that if you manipulated it and did various things to it, that would ultimately get you your chipped, your flake. Sorry. It's sort of like, if you go into into a supermarket and you see a kind of plastic or styrofoam box of eggs, you don't immediately sort of think of omelet, in the sense of it doesn't immediately call to mind the pleasant sensation of a warm cheese omelet or something. You know that it can lead to an omelet based on experience and based on the ability to engage in what I call sort of abstract or imaginary or abstract thinking or imagination. And I'm simply saying that that we can sort of see that here. And that might also sort of provide us with a little bit of insight about Lascaux, because clearly Lascaux involved foresight, not only in the sense of sort of planning the paintings in advance, but the fact that the painting had to occur on a ceiling in a very dark place that in some cases was sort of quite far from the open air. So a few more things about Magdalenian culture as it relates to technology. Archaeologists have identified that at least 6 stages in the development of stone tool production. So one shouldn't just think that once upon a time people had stone tools and then suddenly they invented copper and iron and so on. There are distinct stages to the development of stone tools that one might even think of as kind of progress and development. One interesting feature is that there is a trend towards microliths, i.e. towards smaller and more refined stones. Why? Well, there's certain advantages to smaller stones, such as you can put them on spears or at a certain point on arrows or harpoons that can be thrown and thus are useful in that way that you could not do with a heavier stone. I think it's interesting that in modern society there tends to be kind of an emphasis on or inclination to see miniaturization as a form of technological advancement, and I think you can say in a funny kind of way we see a similar trend in this society as well. Another interesting characteristic that I think sort of goes to this point about forethought and abstraction is clearly there's a conception in this society that certain tools are needed to produce other tools. We have factories that produce machine tools that can be that are used to make other goods in other factories, machines for making machines. Similarly, the society has tools for making tools. One of the things that you can do with the flint tools is carve softer materials, such as bones or antlers, and use those in turn as tools. It seems clear that these kinds of stone tools, for example, were used to produce harpoons for fishing. And if you want a sense of what that looks like, these are examples of I believe bone tools that were probably carved from flint tools. And you can see the one in the middle is perhaps most striking. It's an example of a Magdalenian harpoon. How do you know it's a harpoon? Because it has sort of the sort of pointy edge by which you stab the fish in the stream, and then it has sort of the jagged edges going in the other direction that allows you to pull the fish back out of the water. One thing, though, that we have yet to talk about is their society. In other words, what are the relations between human beings in this society? What activities are they engaged in? And how do they structure their relations with one another? So we've been talking about technology. Let's talk about society. The key thing to understand is that they are hunters and gatherers. Hunting and gathering societies still exist in some parts of the world, although they're obviously increasingly rare. I believe that there are certain societies in sort of the Amazon rainforest where one still finds kind of the final remnants of hunting and gathering societies. But hunting and gathering is what I would call the main form of economic activity. It's really the economic system that exists throughout the Paleolithic period. And I would just say, to return to my word Paleolithic, which remember means Stone Age, the term Paleolithic definitely refers to stone technology, but it really refers to the phase of human social development when humans are hunters and gatherers. And it is, of course, worth noting that for the 36,000 years that anatomically modern human beings have existed, I'm not remembering the exact percentage here or proportion, but something like 3/4 of that has been spent as hunters and gatherers. Fundamentally, we are sort of hunter-gatherers with cell phones right now. Our sort of core and longest-lasting form of social organization is hunting and gathering, and it's only in roughly the last 6,000 years or so that we have diverged from that and adopted new social forms at an increasingly rapid rate. But let me return to hunting and gathering. Hunting and gathering, one thing to understand, of course, as the term suggests, is that it is a society that is based on the hunting of animals and the gathering of various forms of plant life from the environment. Because it is focused on hunting and gathering, it means that the humans are dependent. Humans are always dependent on their environment, but there's a kind of particularly high degree of dependence in this society, in the sense that humans have to follow the food, as it were. They have to follow the herds of animals, and they have to go to where plants in bloom can be found. This has important consequences. This means that these people are semi-nomadic. Nomadic in the sense that they do not have permanent settlement, but that they change their settlement in order to follow the food. And semi-nomadic really just means that they are not, finding a new place to live every night, as it were, but sort of moving from settlements where they'll stay for a period of time, but not for too long before they move on somewhere else. There tends to be a fairly high level of gendered activity. You could say that the form of the division of labor that exists in the society is gendered. Men tend to hunt and protect and make weapons. Women tend to gather, care for children, and make clothes. An interesting feature of this society is that there is no real evidence of war. This is almost kind of a side point, but I think it's an interesting one. And I'm not suggesting that these people are sort of peace-loving hippies. I think there's a great deal of violence and hardship in this society. But the activity of human beings engaging in conscious and deliberate attacks on other human beings is not a significant feature of this society. And one of the reasons is because war tends to sort of go hand in hand with societies that actually have resources that you can take or plunder, take from them or plunder. And that tends to involve the invention of agriculture. It's really only when people have pantries of agricultural produce, wheat, barley, rice, and so on, and usually with that, herds of animals that they are raising to turn into domestic animals, such as horses and other forms of livestock. Only in that kind of situation, where you can engage in raiding of that kind, does war exist. When you're dependent on animals and plants and berries and nuts, there's no sort of premium on engaging in war. You might as well, in a sense, put your effort into slaughtering animals rather than slaughtering human beings, simply because, not because they're more ethical, but because there's no real advantage to it. A few other characteristics of Stone Age culture. Remember Williams' term of culture as referring to a distinct way of life. Well, we see that conception of culture in this case as too. In other words, we have traces of activities that refer not just to technology and not just to social structure, but to some that provides some clues about how these people lived. And I guess in particular, I mean by practices that they engaged in that were not just simply that were not simply economic, that were not simply based on gathering resources for survival. So, for example, there is evidence of the Magdalenian society of burials. This is extremely interesting. Humans, when they die in the society, are not just left where they happen to die so that their remains can return to the elements. There is a conscious choice to bury them, in some cases individually, and there's indications that there are rituals associated with it, such as corpses dressed in clothes, sprinkled with ochre, perhaps wearing ornaments and necklaces. Again, we're in a hermeneutic situation when we think about these things, but it leads us to ask what kind of meanings were attributed to the biological event of death. Death is something that happens to all of us. It's a biological event, but it's something that human beings have typically endowed with coded meanings. And the coded meanings in this case are the clothes, the ornaments, and so on. How do we interpret that? What does this tell us about them? I don't know what the answer is, but they're good questions. There are also evidence of musical instruments. And if you look at the picture here, you can see that bone or antler instruments have been found that suggests that some kind of flute, a hollowed material object that also has holes placed in it, like one that one could use to play notes on and to play music on. So again, we have no idea. It's a fascinating question, but no idea what Paleolithic Magdalenian culture music sounds like. But there's a reasonable basis for believing that it existed. Again, all sort of signs of what one might call a way of life. So I'm going to conclude my lecture here for today, and we've sort of looked at then what we can learn about the people who produced the Lascaux cave art, and you might want to be thinking about, based on the information that I have presented to you, how does that alter or enrich or affect our interpretation of the cave art? What I presented to you is what you might call historical context, even though we're talking about prehistory, meaning we are situating these very specific examples of artwork within the broader context of what we know about this particular society. This is something that I'm going to be doing throughout the semester. We're always going to be looking at cultural works, but I will always be connecting them to a broader historical context and encouraging you to think about what do we learn about the historical society from the cultural artworks, but also in turn, how does understanding the historical context inform our understanding of the particular art cultural works that we're looking at. So quick reminder, and then the goal for Friday's class is going to be to look at 4 interpretations that scholars have proposed of cave paintings with special reference to the Lascaux art. I remind you that you will have 2 readings, or 1 viewing rather, and a reading for Friday that relate to one of these theories of art by this guy named Lewis Williams. There's a video of him and then an article that he wrote with the same French archaeologist that you read, Jean Clotte. And this is about sort of the 4th theory. These have already been placed in As You Learn, and I will also be placing on As You Learn some kind of assignment that I still have to figure out, having to do with what we've done so far. It will either be a written assignment or a Flipgrid. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure talking to you. Have a good day.